Hi, my name's Ted, and today we're going to talk about the digital readout that I installed onto my new-to-me Bridgeport mill, and how a few tips for how I went about installing it that hopefully you find useful. So first thing, what's a digital readout and why would you want one? A digital readout is exactly what the name implies. It is a digital readout of the position of the X, Y, and Z axes for a milling machine. You can also get ones that will have the 4th axis for the quill. That's how far down your bit is going. And then you can also have ones that add in an RPM measurement as well, so that you know your exact spindle speed. I decided to just start off with a basic 3-axis because X, Y, and Z is really what you need the most. RPM and quill I may add at some point, but if you think about it, if you put, for most operations until you get into some complicated angles, you can generally do most of what you need with just your Z-axis going up and down, because you're probably making movements up, down, left, right, etc. When you start getting into some more complicated angle ones, maybe you get to needing it, but I can always add another readout later if I want. Other things that these can do are they can calculate a circle so that you can get a radius if you're trying to drill holes a specific radius from the center. And you notice I've got some numbers up here right now. It's saved where I was before, but you can just reset, get them to 0. So you can set your 0 point. And in fact, I actually ended up using the digital readout as I was installing the digital readout, because you have to install one axis at a time. And when I got to making the bracket to hold the Y-axis in, to use some existing holes that were already on the mill, I needed to machine the bracket to have a slot within that range. So I measured exactly what it needed to be. Started off with the one existing hole in the bracket, or slot in the bracket, reset the X-axis, moved it over the exact amount, and I had a perfectly positioned slot. So it was fun to get to use the milling machine with the tool to help prove the benefit of the tool I was installing. These are really not difficult to install. I've seen some people say it takes about 10 hours. It is a very long job. It is kind of a tedious operation because you really need to take your time, make sure that everything is lined up properly. But that said, these, at least this one that I have, and I'll put a link into the description to what I got. They have enough allowable play in the sensor relative to the bar that you don't have to worry about it being really perfect necessarily. The biggest thing you need to worry about is making sure that the bar is as close to even and level the entire range back and forth, and so that's where you take your time. I spent a lot of time loosely putting these bars in and going back and forth to make sure that I wasn't getting any binding or anything like that. These are really cheap these days. I think I spent about 250 bucks on this 3-axis. There are more expensive options out there. Some of them have more features. Some of them are probably higher quality. But for what I'm going to be doing, this is just fine. I don't need anything that's accurate down to the 10,000th, because I'm not machining jet engine parts. I'm just going to be machining stuff for motorcycles, my RV, cars, things like that. So I'm going to point a couple of things out to you about how I installed this, and hopefully it seems a little bit less scary and worth doing. So one thing I want to show here is what one of the reasons is for wanting a digital readout. So if you take a look, there's a pretty decent amount of play going back and forth in this, and I do need to tighten it up. But if you take a look on the digital readout, as I'm going back and forth, I'm moving this about 90 degrees, and there's really not much of a change in the X-axis. And so with the digital readout, you're literally reading the output of how the table is moving left, right, forward, back, up, down, as opposed to trying to read off of the numbers here. and especially if you've got an older machine that has some more play in it that you haven't adjusted, this is where this gets to be really, really useful to make sure that you're getting parts in the right dimension. And so this is why, part of why I'm perfectly happy and comfortable with a cheaper, probably lower end, lower quality unit, because this is still going to be way, way, way more accurate than what I can do here. So I'll show you, I'll start off with the x-axis. What I did here was I basically just drilled into, don't be afraid to drill into the mill, by the way. These are, big pieces of metal. You're not going to hurt the structure or anything like that. They're designed to be drilled into. So I drilled in over here, tried to keep about the same distance over in both, and when you look at the holes, there ends up being a bit of wiggle room and a bit of slop so that you can get it up and down. But when you're doing that, you kind of need to think out, where are you going to put the sensor? Where can you mount the sensor? Where can you mount the bar? And it needs to be in a position where it's not going to be interfering with anything. So the sensor has to be mounted to one part of the mill that's rigid. The bar needs to be mounted to the part of the axis that's moving, or vice versa. It really doesn't matter which is which. You just have to figure out what's going to work for your installation. The x-axis is probably the one that's a little bit off, because this lock does just graze it right down here, but it's not a big deal. Works well enough. The z-axis is actually what I did first, and in some ways this was probably the hardest one to do. I'm sure somebody else could look at this and come up with a better way to do it. But so what I did here was I put the reader bar mounted vertically here on the main base of the mill, and then these brackets were included. So what I did here was I just put this bracket in the vise and bent it to get it to the right angle to where I could have the sensor bolted to it. Obviously I could have shortened the bracket, but this was the first one I was doing, and I kind of just wanted to see where things went before I did anything. If I ever have to take it off, I'll probably just cut the bracket off there, make that work. And then when you come over, I'll move my little tool cart. You can see here's where I did, this is where I did the y-axis. In this case, I had a couple of existing holes, I had 2 existing holes I wanted to use. This one was just not in the right position, so I had to drill another hole here. I used that existing hole. And then up in here, these were hard to get at. But when you get these, the sensor is already attached to the bar, and so you got to be careful with it. But when you play around with it, you do have some wiggle room, and you can kind of see where it needs to go. So one of these was you can see, well, really, if I come over to this side, I think you can see better. So this was the side where I had to make the new slot, and you can see where the bolt is. That's where the slot needed to be. The one on the outside is the slot that it came with. And so far, it's been working just fine. You can see that it comes with nice long cables, so you just kind of need to drape them around and put them in a position where they're going to be out of the way. But ultimately, I'm really happy with this. For the couple $100 that it cost, it's going to do a whole lot for making sure that the machining that I do with this, especially as a newbie, is going to be more accurate. Back in the old days before digital readouts, you kind of had to develop a real sense of knowing your machine and knowing how it worked. And I'm just never going to get to that point. I'm never going to machine enough, especially with this old machine, to get to the point where I know it. And as I demonstrated for the very first time that I used this to make that slot, worked perfectly the first time. I didn't have to do anything. So then one other thing I'll show, this bracket I did cut down. It originally had come out to here, but I cut it down to make it so that it wasn't sticking out so far. So Again, I'll put some links in the description to what I bought. But this is definitely something I would highly recommend if you have a mill that you're buying and getting yourself set up to do some work at home. So any questions, feel free to put them in the comments. Thanks for watching.